Hi everyone, welcome to the Enthusiastic Buddhist. In this video, I want to address a common question that people often have, and that is whether us as lay people can become enlightened without needing to become a monk or a nun. The specific question I received was from Christoph, who asked, I sometimes hear people saying that lay people cannot reach enlightenment and that it's reserved only for monks and nuns. On the other hand, I recall a book written by a nun, I think, where she claims that a monk's life often lacks impulses for progress and therefore becomes stagnant. I don't know what to think about it. What's your opinion on the matter? Is it easier, harder, or maybe even impossible to reach enlightenment without being a monk or nun? Well, the first thing I want to say is that absolutely it's possible to become enlightened without being a monk or a nun. And the reason is because enlightenment happens because of your state of mind, not because of the clothes you wear. I mean, if you become a monk or a nun, say for cultural reasons, but then you have no interest in practicing meditation or virtue, and you're constantly engaging in worldly affairs, then just being a monk or a nun isn't going to get you any closer to enlightenment. Buddhism is all about training our mind. So if we can live in society as a layperson, but still embrace the Buddhist values of contentment, compassion, non-attachment, and still have the strong desire and discipline to practice the teachings in everything we do, and also keep up a regular meditation practice, then yes, we certainly can have an awakening. You see, enlightenment arises from causes and conditions, and every time you have a virtuous thought or practice a compassionate act, you're creating the causes for enlightenment to arise. And so when you've created enough causes and you have the right conditions, enlightenment is going to happen. Enlightenment is not going to look at your clothes and say, well, they don't seem to be wearing the right clothes. They're not a monk or a nun, so I guess I'm going to have to come back another time. You see what I mean? Whether enlightenment arises in your mind or not is entirely dependent on what is happening in your mind. For instance, how much patience do you have? Can you recognize states of greed, anger, or ignorance in your mind? How much are you trying to purify your mind of these states? How strongly do you want to follow the Buddha's teachings, and how much are you really practicing? If we're really serious about becoming enlightened, then as a layperson following the Buddha's path, we have to be really honest with ourselves. We have to look at what are the things we're doing with our days, what are the things we're doing with our mind, what are the things we care about. You know, how do we spend our time? Are we playing computer games all day, watching TV and just socializing with friends? I mean, our modern life has so many potential distractions, and this is really why some people say that enlightenment only arises for monks and nuns, because they don't have all the distractions that we do as a layperson. And so there is some truth that living as a monastic often brings faster results, because a monastic doesn't need to worry about having a mortgage, they don't usually have to work, and they don't have the distractions of romantic relationships or having children that take up their time. So as you can imagine, this frees up an incredible amount of time. And then with that free time, they can use it for further studying and practice. So obviously, if you dedicate more time for practice, then you're creating more causes for enlightenment. So definitely a monastic's life is very conducive for cultivating one's practice and reaching some stage of awakening, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee it, because it's all dependent on the amount of renunciation and diligence in a person's mind. So the good news is that we can become enlightened as a layperson, but we really have to have a solid desire to incorporate the teachings into everything that we do, because our modern way of life is going to throw up all sorts of enticing distractions for us. So we need to be constantly checking in with our mind and seeing how it's doing in terms of our spiritual development. We need to be making a continuous effort in cultivating our mindfulness, letting go of our anger and prioritizing our meditation practice. I mean, enlightenment won't happen unless we want it to, and we take the necessary steps in order for it to manifest. So we have to ask ourselves, how much do I really want it? Am I doing enough in my day to make it happen? And so as lay people, we need to really ask ourselves the tough questions and be honest with ourselves. And if we know in our hearts that we're not really trying as much as we can because we're getting sidetracked with all these worldly distractions, then we need to look at what kind of changes we can make in order to get our practice back on track. Maybe it could be as simple as reading some more Buddhist books in order to re-inspire ourselves. If we're really serious about achieving enlightenment in one lifetime, then we need to look at ways to enliven our practice, especially if we've lost some of that momentum that we had when we first started. Now, in regards to the nun saying that a monastic's life lacks impulses for progress and therefore becomes stagnant, it's a bit hard to say exactly what she meant by those words, but if we really look at it, generally the most important catalyst for our practice and the main reason that we should be wanting to progress is because of our wish to avoid suffering and dissatisfaction now and in the future. I mean, attaining enlightenment is a freedom from experiencing any kind of suffering. So what motivates us to practice is to finally be free of all suffering and to experience the supreme bliss, happiness and tranquility of mind that comes from becoming enlightened. It's this deep inner longing to experience this everlasting peace and happiness, which really fuels our wish to practice the Buddha's teachings. So whenever we see suffering or we experience it directly in our lives, then that should be a reminder to us as to why we're practicing. And since there's no shortage of suffering for us to see in our daily lives, we really shouldn't lose our motivation to practice and achieve the goal. So really, there shouldn't be any chance for our practice to stagnate. But I guess if we happen to be a monastic and our life was just so luxurious and free of any kind of suffering, then yes, maybe we would we wouldn't have a desire to be free of samsara and our practice might take a hit. But generally a monastic's life is not that comfortable. I mean, it's not so comfortable that we should lose our motivation to practice. So basically what I'm trying to say is that if we have the right motivation, our practice shouldn't stagnate, and that's whether we're a monastic or a householder. And I'll just quickly point out that I've been approaching this question from a Theravada point of view. If I was to give it a Mahayana Buddhist perspective, then I would say that wanting to free all beings from suffering, which actually includes ourselves as well, that should be our motivation for practice. So if that is our motivation, well, that motivation can never be lost as long as there are beings who are suffering in samsara. So again, as long as we're following the Buddha's teachings and the Four Noble Truths, then whether we're a householder or a monastic, our practice should always be increasing until we've completed the goal of attaining enlightenment. Now, just quickly, I want to point out that there are different types of enlightenment, even though we often call all forms of awakening as enlightenment. But there is the supreme, perfect and full enlightenment of the Buddha, which brings with it a mind that is free of all faults and is basically omniscient. And then there is the enlightenment of, say, an arhat, or someone who has had the first major realization of selflessness. So that is someone who has realized that their body and ego are not who they really are, and they're free of identifying themselves in that way. And when you're no longer tied to your body and mind as self, then you stop suffering from all your attachments to things and people who you thought belonged to you, which is when we can truly start practicing unconditional love for everyone and not just have a love that's reserved for those who are closest to us. And this is the first stage, and this first stage of awakening is certainly attainable by anyone who really puts their mind towards the practice and teachings. But when you talk about the full enlightenment of the Buddha, that's a totally different story. A fully enlightened Buddha is an extremely rare state of enlightenment. You basically have to have the Bodhisattva's mind of wanting to return to the world in order to teach the Dharma. And in that case, generally all Buddhas will follow a similar life path of first being born as a prince, renouncing the palace life, becoming a monk in order to practice, and then teaching the Dharma to others. So in that case, when we're talking about the supreme enlightenment of the Buddha, if you wanted to show and attain that, then yes, you would need to take the role of a monk to become fully enlightened, because it's kind of part of the job description of becoming a Buddha. So to answer your question, is it easier, harder, or maybe even impossible to reach enlightenment without being a monk or a nun? As I said, it's certainly not impossible. There are definitely lay people who have become awakened, men and women. For example, Dipa Ma, who was a teacher of Jack Cornfield and Sharon Salzberg, she was highly realised. She only passed away in 1989, and there's this great biography that you can read about her, which is really inspirational. But yes, I would say that it's definitely harder to practice as a layperson than as a monastic, because our lives are generally far more complicated. We have more responsibilities, which are usually financial, and we have so many potential distractions that could take our mind away from the practice. So as a layperson, we need to essentially maintain our thirst for enlightenment. I mean, if we have this thirst or craving for enlightenment, then becoming enlightened as a householder is possible, because we will continue to engage in Buddhist practice even though we're carrying out worldly activities. So yes, as a layperson, we still have to work and pay our mortgage. But what are we doing with our mind? What is our attitude towards our mortgage? Do we see it as simply a necessity of the modern life? Or do we think our happiness lies on the end of paying it off? I mean, our suffering might be lessened once we pay it off, but do we really think that everlasting happiness comes from owning a house? It's good for us to check in on our beliefs and see what we're chasing and why. If we think owning more houses and having nice possessions equals everlasting happiness, then the Buddha would have to say, I'm sorry, but it doesn't, because nothing is permanently satisfactory. I mean, in this case, by the time we've paid off our mortgage, we often have other fun things like old age and death to contend with. So to think everlasting happiness is at the end of some mortgage isn't wisdom, basically. And so we need to be cultivating this jewel of our mind now, rather than simply trying to acquire more stuff that doesn't promise us happiness. So if we want to practice in society, we have to watch our mind and make sure that we're not deluding ourselves and forgetting the teachings. And if we keep the Buddha's principles as our guiding light and we practice them, we will be assured success, because the formula for enlightenment is create the causes and the results will follow. It's only a matter of time. Now, of course, it's possible that enlightenment won't come to fruition in this life, but if you're practicing the teachings of morality, mindfulness and meditation, you'll actually start reaping the benefits of the practice long before you get anywhere near to reaching enlightenment. And this is what makes the path so joyous. You don't need to wait until you're enlightened or wait until your next life to start experiencing happiness. Merely doing daily practice now is going to create a shift in everything you do, say and think. And that alone will start to bring you happiness from day one. So I hope that's helped to answer your question, Christoph. If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to ask them below. So take care everyone, and I hope to see you in the next video.